Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to your morning briefing for Tuesday, the 22nd of April, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway. Robert, good morning. All right, the FAA is releasing some changes to this notice of airmen, which restricts airspace, correct?
Correct.
Or it alerts pilots to some sort of restricted airspace. What's going on?
Yeah, the Notice Airman system it gives out safety information for flights and includes like runway closures and obstacles and airspace closures. And the FAA said that they're speeding up the modernization of the system, and they're expecting the beginnings of this modernization to be on track for beginning in July and actually be operational by September. And the changes here, they're going to make the NOTAM system actually be a cloud computing system, which I think might introduce some vulnerabilities, some cyber vulnerabilities. But they said the idea is for it to be flexible and have much greater real-time data access for flights and pilots.
All right, interesting. Let's move on here to some drug prices. Robert, I've often wondered, as many others have, I'm sure, if some prescription drug costs $100 in the United States, it might cost $50 or $20 in some foreign country. Why is that? And I guess President Trump is looking at changing that, maybe.
Yeah, this is according to people familiar with the matter that work in apparently some drug companies. And they said the Trump administration is considering plans to peg U.S. domestic drug prices to these lower international drug prices. And they said specifically in foreign developed countries. So I think they're talking about like Europe, where, as you said, we might pay $100 for a prescription drug here in the U.S. that costs $20 in Germany or France. And yeah, I think if this is true, that this means significantly lower prices in the U.S., but this would also, I think, create an obstacle to reshoring drug production and also probably hit pharmaceutical research and development as well. Because the argument from pharma companies is they use the higher U.S. drug prices to pay for research and development.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then let's focus here on the Supreme Court. There's an oral arguments taking place, or at least scheduled, on the 15th of May. And it looks like they may actually make a ruling on these injunctions from these lower federal courts. What's going on?
Well, this is a lawsuit that was filed against the Trump administration over Trump's attempt to end birthright citizenship by executive order. And the Trump administration has asked the Supreme Court to narrow or limit those nationwide injunctions that, in this case, issued by 3 different federal district courts. And I think if the Supreme Court does limit these orders, this would remove a key legal tool for the Trump Resistance 2.0, which has relied on filing a lawsuit in a single district court, usually through judge shopping or court shopping, where they look for a sympathetic judge to put in these nationwide injunctions. And this would require them to expend a lot more legal effort and time and resources in all 94 district courts to actually block these executive actions. Just based on what I've read on the opinions of the justices on these, there's already 3. That's Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch that have openly said, I think in a case last year, that they think the Supreme Court should rein in these federal district court nationwide injunctions. I think Kavanaugh has also said he would support curtailing them. I think the key vote here is going to be Chief Justice Roberts, because I still maintain that he is trying to find some type of middle ground here between the Trump resistance and the Trump administration. And I think he's trying to balance the legitimacy of the courts with what I think are, appear to be like very clearly political rulings to undermine the president's constitutional powers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm pretty amazed still. I guess I shouldn't be. Going back to, what was it, in 2020, Roberts may have been the deciding vote, but I think he wrote the majority opinion over the commerce. This commerce secretary at that point was trying to include this citizenship question in the 2020 census. And he said, it's not unconstitutional. We just don't like how you got around to it, or we don't like how you came to this conclusion that you were going to add it or whatever happened. And they struck it down, which is kind of inconceivable. Is this back during the first Trump administration? They floated changing a rule, or maybe getting the Supreme Court to rule on this, basically saying if a district court judge issues an injunction against the Trump administration, it applies only to that district and it is not nationally injuncted. Is this essentially what we're looking at here, Robert?
Yeah, that's what the Trump administration is trying to do. And the reason why I think Chief Justice Roberts might side with the Trump administration on this is that this and that case over the remigration flights under the Alien Enemies Act, I think the Supreme Court is getting to a point where they can't just push those off like they have in the past. Like you said, they've usually said the Trump administration didn't follow all 50 steps in the Administrative Procedures Act. So even though they have the power to do this, we're going to block it. I think in this case, these two cases are so politically charged, and I think the view of the legitimacy of the court is such a strong question here that Chief Justice Roberts can't just push, or will likely view that he can't just push this off again like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems to me we are nearing this culmination point, especially over the courts. As we've been talking about, and plenty of people have mentioned on social media, including Bill Ackman, there was no due process involved when the country was being flooded with tens of millions of illegals. And it's unfair and kind of unconscionable that all 10 to 30 million illegals could have a court date and a hearing prior to being deported. And that's just so unrealistic. So May 15th, oral arguments start, and then they're going to rule on this by June, I guess.
I think so. They're probably going to want a ruling on this pretty quickly. If Robert's concern is this narrative of a constitutional crisis or potential real constitutional crisis between Trump and the courts, he's going to want a definitive answer as soon as possible so that we don't end up in a situation where Trump is openly defying more of these court orders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like the Supreme. I'm not that sympathetic towards Chief Justice Roberts, but it does seem like he's kind of in a no-win situation here. He rules against these district courts, and they're going to be processed by the left. There's already been, wasn't there some guy was arrested for plotting to kill him or something like that?
Kavanaugh, actually. There was a guy who was caught by the U.S. Marshals with a gun at Kavanaugh's home.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then if he rules against the Trump administration in favor of these lower courts, it's going to hamstring the Trump administration in so many ways. I mean, effectively, we will not have a Trump administration. We'll have a president, but an executive branch that struggles to implement even the most basic of policies. If any lower court judge can just issue an injunction that takes months or years to resolve. So thanks for staying on top of that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to today's roll-up items, starting with Arizona. I'll let you take it away.
So Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs, who's a Democrat, she vetoed a state-level bill that was passed by the Arizona legislature that would have required state and local officials to cooperate with ICE in these federal immigration efforts. This is, I think people compare Trump's remigration efforts a lot with Eisenhower, but I think what's key here that this shows is that Eisenhower had basically cooperation of all states when he conducted mass deportations in the past, but we're seeing that a lot of these border states, even if they pass bills like this to cooperate with the Trump administration, their Democrat governors and these local level officials have openly declared that they're going to attempt to disrupt this effort. And they really only have to do so by just not doing anything, by not cooperating. And then a research firm named Arrow Shipbroking Group, they crunched the numbers on this U.S. trade representative rule that we covered a few weeks ago. And they're saying that Chinese-owned or operated oil supertankers are going to have to pay up to $5.2 million per port call under these new rules. Because the U.S. Trade Representative, the original proposal was, I think, $1.5 million per port call, but now they have a formula for cargo volume. And they said any Chinese-made supertankers that are not Chinese-owned or operated will have to pay about $2 million per port call. And I think sorry, go ahead.
Oh, you go up, you finish.
Yeah, I think this is, I've already seen that on the cargo side, this started having the intended impact before the rule even went into place. A lot of these international shippers started talking about reconfiguring their fleets to only have their U.S. made or non-Chinese made ships make U.S. port calls. And it's also been undermining Chinese sales of both new and used ships, and which I think is the intended effect here is to undermine China's market dominance over global shipping.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I will remind everyone, if you have not seen the Tucker Carlson interview with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, you should. Bessent says China's in a deflationary recession / depression. They're trying to export their way out of it. He says, quote, we can't allow them to do that. Robert, I think you're spot on. This is just another feather on the camel's back here to hamper Chinese exports, especially to the United States. All right. And then we've also been talking about this U.S.-Mexico water treaty that Mexico has been in violation of for the past year or so. This treaty was started back in 1944, and apparently Mexico is trying to negotiate over this. Can you just remind us briefly what exactly this treaty says and then how it's being violated? You or Jared?
Yeah, according to this treaty, Mexico and some of the states out west and the southwest are supposed to share water over the border, because all of these states in Mexico rely on water from the Colorado River Basin. And Mexico has been shorting deliveries for about the past year and a half. They're supposed to provide so much amount of water over a 5-year period, and then some amount of that within every year. And Mexico's been dealing with a major water security situation. I think as late as early 2024, they were talking about drinking water shortages in Mexico City because their main source of fresh water was basically evaporating away. But if they don't share water, if this water treaty is not heeded by Mexico, we could run into a situation like we did in, I think it was late 2023, heading into 2024, where people in the Southwest, officials were warning that areas like Lake Mead could head to a dead pool situation, which means water stops flowing downriver and cuts off drinking water, water for agriculture, and even for hydropower.
And that's for everybody, including Mexico.
Yes.
Okay. I remember that, and one of the concerns was, is this going to put more pressure on migration from Mexico into the United States if Mexico City, which is, I think has like 20 million people or something like that, if they run out of water? I've not seen, they did go through a really bad drought. I don't know if that drought is still continuing, but Robert, what are your kind of second and third order concerns here?
Well, I think Mexico is under pressure to not comply here. And Sheinbaum has already said that when she came out and said, well, we're going to find a way to comply with this, she used the caveat of basically if it doesn't make Mexico's water security situation worse. So this might be, I don't want to say an armed conflict over water, but a diplomatic conflict over water, probably the first for the United States explicitly to have a diplomatic situation here where we're fighting over water resources that are, officials are warning that we're going to be under a major drought in the Southwest, and we need access to that water, and so does Mexico. So I think this is going to end up in a back and forth diplomatic conflict over these water resources.
Mm-hmm. I remember back in the 2010s, the Army published a white paper about water wars, basically how a lot of countries are going to be going to physical armed conflict with each other over access to water. Also, there was a real estate, I guess, who's a magnate, I think a big guy in real estate. He's been buying up property in the Midwest because his entire thesis is we're going to go through a drought period, a long-term drought period that's going to force people in the West out of the West because it's dry. They live in deserts. It's going to be unsustainable to live there due to water shortages. And he said all those people are going to be moving to the Midwest. I don't know. I thought it was interesting. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to China and South Korea. So, Jared, just in the past day or two, we've heard about maybe South Korea applying tariffs to Chinese steel. We've also talked about maybe the United States moving some of it, either purchasing ships, Navy ships from South Korea, or maybe moving manufacturing to South Korea. This is specifically ahead of a potential Indo-Pacific conflict. And now they have a maritime dispute with China. It seems like this is maybe not a good thing for South Korea. What's going on?
Yeah. Probably not a good thing for South Korea in the short term. We'll see long term. So South Korea is considering building a competing permanent structure in their overlapping territorial waters with China. They have basically a shared fishing zone, and the agreement was no permanent structures. China went off and built one. I think it was earlier this year, maybe late last year, and that has set off South Korea. China's not been forthwith with, hey, why do you even have this? So South Korea is looking to also violate that agreement and build a competing permanent structure. And this will, I think this is first steps towards a worsening conflict between the two, which this is yet another territorial dispute China has with its neighbors. If I'm being frank, it was basically just the Koreas that it didn't have a territorial dispute with in the region. So here we are adding another onto the pile.
And then briefly, Jared, when you say permanent structure, you're talking about a military facility, like an artificial island.
So they haven't even been clear on what exactly this is for. They built a steel structure in the middle of the Yellow Sea that would basically overlook any kind of routes from Japan and South Korea to help Taiwan. So I think there will be a military application there, but frankly, nobody even knows what this thing is doing. It's just, you weren't supposed to do this. You built it under the cover of night, and now it's here, and you won't tell us what it's for. So we are going to have to permanently monitor you. And it is in a very strategic location.
All right. Yeah. Speaking of steel, let's move to India.
India is placing a 12% tariff on all steel, but specifically to prevent Chinese steel dumping and protect India's steel production. This comes right after J.D. Vance's visit with Modi, after they said that, we made some great progress and a potential deal. So this may be coming out of that meeting there. But bottom line is, this will test China's declaration that we covered yesterday of reciprocal action on limited trade. India is going to be the first to find out if China's actually serious about conducting a trade war with everybody. Over in Europe, the U.S. is meeting with European officials from the UK, France, Germany, and Ukraine tomorrow in London to discuss the peace deal with Russia. We covered very briefly what some of those frameworks might look like yesterday. They'll probably be hashing that out tomorrow. And again, on negotiations, we've been covering the Iran deal that's being worked out. Iran said that they want sanctions relief as part of these nuclear deal negotiations. And given the hot button sanctions that we are leveling on Iran right now, I think what that really is going to boil down to is Iran has to stop selling oil to China, which cuts off a major oil supplier to China as China prepares for war in the late 2020s.
We have talked about the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, essentially being dead. It was dead on paper. Now I think it's physically dead all around. No construction, no pipelines, no roads, I think anything. How, even if Iran continues to sell oil to China, is that coming over land or over through the sea?
Right now it's coming through the sea. They run up to the ports on basically China's only seaboard, but that's subject to the Malacca. It's overseen by India. You have to run through the Andamans. Like there are so many ways to cut that off in the event of a war. And here we're just trying to say, stop it now, and we won't hurt your people.
All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on to today's warning items, starting with this upcoming May 5th day of action. We've been talking about this off and on here for a week or so now. Left-wing groups have organized at least 350 day of action protests and rallies. This is coming up on Thursday, the 1st of May, otherwise called May Day or International Workers' Day. I also thought this was interesting. They are scheduling these walk-in events at schools. And what's going to happen is they're going to gather activists, protesters, speakers. They're going to gather outside of public schools and hold a rally, have 2, 3, 4 speakers talk about whatever. And apparently the stuff that's happening at the schools, they're going to be students demanding changes at schools. I don't know exactly what those are. I'm sure they're going to be some kind of weird progressive social demands. At any rate, May Day is not just limited to the streets of big cities. It is also happening at schools. Organizers continue to stress a commitment to nonviolent action. They're instructing all participants to, quote, de-escalate any potential confrontation. So at least for the progressive left, it should not be that rowdy. I still have not seen a lot of things from far left like Antifa groups Typically May Day, I remember living in downtown Austin. It was every May Day they would come out, or they would come out the weekend following. And by the way, May Day does fall on a Thursday this year. However, there are going to be some events happening over the weekend as well. And I just saw the far left groups, the Antifa groups out in Seattle, they're having a bonfire and like a picnic for their May Day. I don't know if they're going to go out and try to riot. That has not worked well for them previously, with Seattle Police Department actually enforcing the law against them. At any rate, listen, this is going to be the third national day of protest, or national day of action in the past month. I've seen some activists question whether these national events are occurring so frequently that that they're concerned that the movement is going to lose some enthusiasm and turnout is going to be lower. We saw the April 5th day of protest. We saw the April 19th day of protest. Now we have the upcoming Thursday, May 1st. It's just over a week away. There are 355 scheduled May Day protests and rally events as of this morning. That's about a third of the size of the April 5th day of action. Because this is happening on a Thursday, I doubt we see the kind of turnout we did on April 5th. So may actually be much smaller, not just in scope, in volume of events, but also in total turnout. I think 5 million is way too high of an estimate for that April 5th day of action. 3 million is probably more realistic. I doubt we see, I would say 3 million is at a ceiling. But since there are fewer events, they may attract the same amount of people, just at fewer locations. Something I'm keeping an eye on, and if I start seeing these Antifa groups, they've been really, really quiet. If I start seeing them show any indications of action, I'll let you know. Moving on here. All right, Raskin, Robert. He's Jamie Raskin. I'm pretty sure his father was a communist, and he's been one of the main ringleaders of the impeachment during the first term. He's, I think, probably one of the main guys in the Trump resistance in Congress here. And he was on, I didn't watch this, but apparently he was on some podcast and saying some maybe incendiary things. What's going on?
Yeah, this was Pod Save America, which is a major podcast that was set up by former Obama people. When he was there, he was asked, what should Democrats be doing about the Trump administration? He actually called for the Democratic Party to engage in what he called transnational democratic solidarity. And he said this was solidarity with global democratic governments and movements to prevent what he called the spread of lawlessness and fascist chaos. But something else that stuck out to me in his comments was that he warned that when Democrats come back to power, that they will not look kindly upon, quote, people who facilitated authoritarianism in the United States. And to me, this is a significant rhetorical escalation from the Trump resistance. And while I think in the context of the podcast, he was aiming this at Latin American governments that cooperate with Trump on remigration, I think it's pretty clearly this is an implied threat of retribution when Democrats retake power, that they're going to aim at domestic political opposition.
Mm-hmm. I've thought a lot about this, Robert. We're maybe a few years away from Democrats coming back into power. I think, pardon my language, there's a very good chance that there's going to be hell to pay for some people. I will tell you, just looking at this, looking at all the talk on social media, on the left-wing blogs and all this stuff, I think they're having a really, really difficult time building a national movement around one unifying thing. In 2011, we had Occupy Wall Street. Okay, that's kind of one thing, anti-Wall Street thing. In 2020, we had Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives. That's kind of, one issue. In 2017 through 2020, we kind of had this general anti-Trump stuff. When I look at what's happening with these protest groups now, they're mobilizing people around Social Security, protecting Social Security, around Medicare, workers' rights, trans rights, protecting my democracy. I just see a lot of different things out there, and it leads me to believe that they cannot build a national protest movement around one single thing like they did in 2011 or 2020. Looking at Raskin here, again, as kind of one of the ringleaders of the Trump resistance, and certainly one of the architects of the impeachment process. I do not see I think they're far weaker today than they were, and is all they can do at this point is just hope that they come back into power in 2029. By the way, I saw where the Heritage Foundation starting work now on Project 2029. I guess they're not going to be done with Project 2025. But Robert, is this Jamie Raskin's best hope here, realistically, that they just wait until they come back into power?
I think so. They've been really centralizing around, because Democrats are afraid to talk about immigration because that was a major wedge issue that got Trump across the finish line in 2024. And it has a lot of bipartisan appeal. So they've been focusing less on that. And one of these other issues, they're focusing on due process in trying to get around the immigration problem for them. But I think their best hope is to wait to retake power eventually. I think they're expecting like blowback on tariffs and some of these other. I think they're actually expecting a blowback on remigration as well. Their argument being that Americans don't want to work in agriculture or construction or manufacturing. They're going to want these cheap goods and cheap services. So they're going once thing prices start to go up. In their argument that Americans are going to turn on Trump. And I think what he's saying here is that when they do, in his expectation, when they do retake power, they're going to go back to using tools of the federal government to go after political opposition, like criminal and civil lawsuits, trying to go after Trump again and Trump officials. And I think even Trump officials probably recognize this, that if they don't succeed during this administration, some of them are facing possibly jail. If I remember right, even like Peter Navarro also went to jail. He's now in the White House as an economic advisor. Some of these guys have been disbarred since 2020, and they expect that to be ramped up. And I think it's what Raskin is threatening here.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that. Let's go ahead and move on. Next item, I believe, is Jared's. All right, Jared, you've been talking about this for a while, how the United States is not only arming Taiwan, but the Philippines, other countries. And we have an image here, and this shows the range. But in previous weeks, and I think even going back to last year, you talked about how these countries can reach out and touch China because they're in missile range. I want to step us through what you're seeing here.
Okay, so there are a couple of big things happening specifically around missiles here with Balikatan, which we basically cover every year. Now, Balikatan is having a very symbolic but practical maritime strike exercise at the same time that the U.S. Marine Corps is publicly stating they have stationed a Nemesis anti-ship missile system in the Luzon Strait, which you can see right at the center of that map. On the 5th of May, the Philippines will launch at least one air-launched anti-ship cruise missile and one surface-launched anti-ship cruise missile at the former USS Brattleboro. Now, I say at least because typically a missile will not sink. A single missile, even two missiles, will not normally sink a ship. I think it's likely to be a lot more. And they had a whole list of potential platforms to launch from. I think they're going to launch a lot more. Now, this exercise is taking place in the West Philippine Sea, where the Filipinos have had repeated run-ins with the Chinese Coast Guard, and the target ship is the size of a Chinese Coast Guard cutter. Very, very explicit messaging. Hey, we're preparing to shoot you. And the Chinese Coast Guards don't typically have missile defense, so they would just be fully exposed to this. Now, the Nemesis missile system, that would shut down the Luzon Strait here. You can see it runs basically from the top of the Philippines all the way to the coast of Taiwan. If we were able to zoom in, you can actually see it covers just the tip of Taiwan as well. Mm-hmm. So this puts China on the horns of several dilemmas. We've talked about the brush fire a couple of years ago. Here's all of them being lit at once. It risks exposing.
So that argument was kind of the United States may be in a position to cause multiple brush fires in China's backyard and force them to deal with multiple small dilemmas or crises, and essentially overwhelm them with the need for resources and attention.
Yes.
Okay, so is that what's happening here now?
I think so, and it looks like no matter what China chooses, basically they just have to choose what they view as the least bad option. So they're going to have, like I mentioned, the Chinese Coast Guards don't typically have missile defenses. Now that the South China Sea is becoming a missile-rich environment, the Chinese will either have to retrofit all of their Coast Guard, which is extremely costly, or station People's Liberation Army Navy assets down there to act as air defense pickets, sucking up an enormous amount of resources because the South China Sea is not small. It's you can see from the Philippines over to Vietnam, all the way down to the edge of the map. That's the South China Sea, far larger than what they would have to do for Taiwan. So if they want to maintain their claim, they have to put missile defense assets there, basically saying we are giving up on taking Taiwan. Mm-hmm. Now, additionally, the Nemesis missile system, with it shutting down the Batanes Strait, there's one of two bad options there. Either when China wants to switch from an exercise to a blockade, they have to disable all of the Nemesis missile systems all at once, giving up the element of surprise, or isolate a strike group. Where they normally place their strike group is just north of that Nemesis range on the outside of Taiwan. And what that would do is isolate a strike group, allowing the United States Navy to have basically send a strike group in there on its own to face them 1v1. And that is a losing proposition for anybody. The U.S. Navy strike group is larger with better quality equipment. It would absolutely wreck that. And that makes up, on paper, 1/3 of China's maritime air dominance capability. But realistically, it's actually 1/2 because their first strike group, the Liaoning strike group, is actually only a training strike group, not an operational strike group. It can be pressed into one if needed. So they're risking potentially up to half of their entire naval air dominance capability if they carry forward with what they have been practicing. Mm-hmm. Now, what all this means, if China wants to retain an effective blockade, technically they could still do it. They've got a couple of weeks. They would have to kick this off in a couple of weeks. Otherwise, they're pretty much, going to have to deal with all of these extra systems that they can't deal with. They would have to give up any kind of surprise, which allows Taiwan to respond more effectively. Or they restructure their strategy. That's what that does, is potentially push them far past the 2027 deadline, because they would have to develop a new strategy, then B, implement it from top down as they do, because they don't have an effective NCO core to implement it from the bottom the way that the U.S. Navy does. That means effectively we're looking at either a very imminent war with China or no war for the next few years, way past 27.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, we have been talking about how the clock is ticking down on China. The longer they wait on Taiwan militarily, even if it's just a blockade, the longer they wait, the more they're going to have to deal with this constellation of U.S. allies and weapon systems. Jared?
I do want to say if they were to move now, I don't think they could even necessarily run a blockade, because that Nemesis missile system is there. What they would probably have to do is just go for a full-on invasion. That's still a losing proposition. And no matter what, they have to give up the South China Sea, because all of their assets need to be developed or need to be dedicated to Taiwan. They still lose territory in that war, and there's no way to not give up some things.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's talk about this map here. So there's the Nemesis range. That's a U.S. operated, you said, anti-ship missile system. Okay.
Yes.
Is that mobile? Is that fixed, or can that be moved?
Oh man, it's a cool system. It's very mobile. It's entirely unmanned, can be shot remotely, and it operates via a data link, which data links are secure and point to point. So you can and the Marine Corps operates these things, and I want to say it's like a dozen at a time. So you can distribute these things. They haven't publicized it, but if I was planning this, I'd park a few of them up in the Nansei Islands up there. That way you trisect any kind of blockade and say, okay, look, we will fully isolate you and we're going to crush you against Taiwan. But what that does is allow the Marine Corps to not even risk personnel. You would have to shut down all of these things all at once. They're mobile, they're hard to find, and you can remotely operate them, so their sensors aren't even telling you where they are. Like if they're data linked, you could send that data link from a ship in the Philippine Sea to them.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then let's move on to the next, the SM6 range. Explain to us the significance of that.
The Typhon system that we've covered being in the Philippines, nobody's declared what missile system is or what missiles are actually in it. So the two that it is capable of firing, the SM6 and the Tomahawk or Tomahawk Land Attack Missile Conventional, TLAMC, those are the two that are there. The SM6 basically provides an air defense bubble around the capitals of the Philippines. And if the Tomahawks are in there, that gives the Philippines, the U.S. Army, but not only the Philippines, the ability to reach out and touch basically all of China, as well as several of its strategic petroleum reserves and the Southern Theater Command over in Hainan, which is that island hanging off of China.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're talking about a single battery, a single launch system, the tubes, capable of firing this. Are all SM systems they're all service to air defense, correct? Or air defense systems.
They are, but the SM6 is really cool in that it can also be pressed into a surface roll, so you can actually do land attack and you can do anti-ship as well. But as you can see, unless you put it on a coast, it's not going to reach out very far for an anti-ship. The main thing there would be if this gives the Philippines the ability to reach out and touch China while also having an air defense or anti-ballistic missile capability itself. So it would be able to defend itself if China decides to launch reciprocal or even preemptive homeland strikes on the Philippines.
Okay. And then that TLAMC, you said that's the Tomahawk cruise missile?
Yes. Yes, that is a Tomahawk cruise missile. I did use an older version because I don't know what kind of version the Army would have given to the Philippines. We have to keep in mind this is technically not us. It could actually reach a little bit farther if they're using an updated version of it. And we could potentially see them use the Maritime Strike Tomahawk. Again, that's technically new technology. It's reemergent technology, which would turn that giant red circle into a threat against ships as well.
Okay. So we're going to stay in the weeds just for one more question here.
Okay.
So effective, what we've seen is not only this porcupine strategy of defending Taiwan, arming Taiwan to the teeth so they can potentially sink all these Chinese ships coming over the Taiwan Strait. But also now we have the Philippines
Philippines able to back them up
to a degree. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And then they also have to deal with Japan. How about Vietnam? Vietnam, small country, small Navy. We've seen the Indians actually give Vietnam some Navy ships, I think for mainly maritime patrols and security. Are they a player or non-player in this?
I think they're a coin flip on it. They have outstanding territorial disputes with China, and they want their Paracel Islands back. That's a 50-year-old conflict with them. I would not be shocked to see Vietnam take a very early step into this conflict. And if they do, Vietnam sits right next to Hainan there. They threaten the entire Southern Theater Command, which is the main invasion force to Taiwan. So again, Vietnam can get its piece of the pie. It doesn't have to expand power out to Taiwan. And maybe even it makes an extra couple of claims down in the South China Sea that aren't the Paracels.
Mm-hmm. All right. Interesting, Jared. We've previously, one of the recurring themes in all of this is historically when China gets backed up against the wall, they tend to take action, create a crisis or take military action. And I've seen several comments here in the chat of people saying China as this most recent comment says, China may have to use it now or lose it. All right. Thanks, Jared. With that, let's go ahead and get into today's questions. All right. So China cut off the export of pharmaceutical precursors and medicines to the United States. Roughly, how long would it take for U.S. pharma producers to run out of the raw supplies they already have? Jared, this seems, we've been talking about this as a national security issue. And maybe even Robert, has there been any indication that we have a national strategic pharmaceutical stockpile or something equivalent?
I haven't seen any moves on a stockpile, but there was a Government Accountability Office report from 2023 where these pharmaceutical manufacturers said they would have, depending on the specific chemical, 30 to 90 days worth on hand at any given time. So if there was a cutoff from China, and just to caveat that, we don't get all APIs from China, but they are a major importer, or for us, of APIs. We also get APIs from, I think, a couple of European countries in limited numbers, and India as well. But it would be a significant hit, and 30 to 90 days seems to be the range that I've seen.
Yeah. We were talking about that, I think, last week in the post show, Robert and I, and being that they're precursor chemicals, I think we should keep in mind that that's 30 to 90 days worth of manufacturing capability. So it may actually even last a fair bit longer, giving us the ability to reshore a lot of those, or even up production for the other API sources.
Well, the obstacle to that I've seen, a lot of these pharmaceutical companies have said that there are regulations on permitting for these chemicals, for actually being able to manufacture these chemicals in the U.S., that have stopped them from doing that. Basically, getting a permit for an API for a key drug, they said could take more than a year to get through the permitting process. So on that front, reshoring, I would expect the Trump administration would try to get that down, but without any changes, it would be possibly up to a year before they could start making their own.
So stock up now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, we've been telling folks for years, and not just us, but lots of people have been saying this also. All right. Yeah. Great question, Robert, Jared. Thanks. All right. How do we defend against the expanding Muslim enclaves? All right. So there's this thing called Epic City here in Texas, and apparently Governor Abbott has taken money from the developer of that, but it's supposed to be this Muslim-only neighborhood subdivisions that surround a mosque, and they have their madrasas, the schools and stuff there. And apparently so the question is, we, especially here in Texas, we do see the Muslim population growing, and they're starting to do things like this, try to create these Muslim enclaves, which completely violates kind of the spirit of assimilation. These are not assimilating communities. These are exclusive communities for Muslims only. Apparently you have to be a Muslim to live there. It's not, I don't think it's constructed yet. And it may be, I think our attorney general's been trying to hang them up also. It's odd. I drove down to Sugar Land, I think it was last week, which is right outside, it's in the Houston periphery. And I wanted to see that monkey statue for myself. There's this statue of Hanuman, which is some monkey deity in Hinduism. And I wanted to see it for myself. I think it's now the tallest statue in the state of Texas is Hindu. And I was driving through there, and there were political campaign signs because there's elections coming up, I think in early May, and there were city council elections. And they were Indian names, or they were at least not, you drive around Texas, you see English names, German last names, Spanish last names, Gonzalez, whatever, Hernandez. These were names that at first glance I had trouble pronouncing, just to be honest with you. It was very foreign. I would just say that. I felt very foreign driving through parts of Sugar Land. So the question is, how do you, I don't know. I mean, easier said than done. I dislike the enclaves and stuff that they're building. I don't like the creeping culture. I mean, you look at parts of Little Somalia, you look at parts of like Minneapolis and other places in Minnesota, Dearborn, Michigan. And I mean, they have just completely taken over certain areas. I obviously don't want to see that in Texas, but that's exactly what's happening. So I don't know. I guess you have to either force assimilation. I don't know. Robert, Jared, I mean, I think we all know some solutions, but operating within legal confines, I think you do exactly what Ken Paxton is doing and saying this is like basically a form of discrimination. You cannot keep, like in the case of EPIC, which is I don't even remember what it stands for, but I think it's up near Dallas. this exclusive Islamic community, basically saying, well, it's discrimination. You can't prevent people from not moving there. I don't know.
That is
the solution. The solution is either cultural, you assimilate everyone into an American culture, or you have the conclaves. I think, or the enclaves. I think that is probably the only two options we're looking at.
Yeah, that's the problem. So Canada is going through something similar. I think they are up to like 40 or 50, like almost 50% foreign-born population in Canada. So they no longer have assimilation. They have these huge ethnic enclaves to the point where foreign national-born members of parliament are sicking their foreign national-born voters on their foreign national-born rivals, as I think we talked about in Canada, where that Chinese member of parliament told his voters to go basically arrest a conservative Chinese member of parliament and turn them into the consulate. And then there's been a lot of like Sikhs are a big ethnic enclave in Canada as well. As far as the legal side, it's tough because by the letter of the law, and I think Christopher Rufo has been really pushing this as in what he seems to have some influence in the White House, of trying to use the Civil Rights Act, the text of it, to argue against this type of stuff. But I think in actually how the law has been implemented and enforced in case law, that's kind of an obstacle. Like there are explicit protected classes that by court decisions effectively can get away with this kind of thing when others can't. So I don't know what legal options necessarily will actually work out in trying to undermine, trying to prevent these major ethnic enclaves from popping up.
Mm-hmm. All right. Also, I think there are deep cultural and religious issues that are probably incompatible with a free society. And really, I mean, they're effectively using our free, and I hate to use the term open society, but that's kind of what we are. They're exploiting that free and open society. This is the fundamental problem that I have, even with like anarcho-capitalists that don't believe in borders. How do you prevent 20 million Chinese people from moving to a city and taking over? I mean, that's the ANCAP utopia, is a borderless society. So at any rate, I don't know. It's kind of what we got. Right. There's surprising patience for Pam Bondi's inaction on high-profile prosecutions in some circles. Yeah, where are the Epstein files? There's all this government corruption and fraud. Where are the arrests? But some patience is waning. Does the Attorney General inaction, real or perceived, threaten to fracture Trump support? I think not yet. But I think the Trump base can be appeased with some action, as opposed to nothing. Robert?
I've seen the same criticism, and I agree largely with the criticisms of Bondi as the Attorney General. And also Kash Patel and Dan Bongino at FBI, that they're not doing what they said they were going to do, and they seem to have been captured by the institutions. I agree. I don't think that we're at that point where the Trump base is going to be fractured by this, because there are other areas where the Trump base is signaling they're getting what they want, and that's immigration, even if there are these roadblocks being put up in tariffs. Like that was before the 2024 election happened. I saw some polling, and a lot of the non-internal polling, like the media and the university polling and stuff, is not 100% accurate. It might be directionally correct, but one of the places I saw that I thought gave Trump a major advantage was that in some of these key swing states, there was a majority support for implementing tariffs. And that is one of the big issues, I think, that will keep the Trump base together, because the Trump base is not necessarily people like Bill Ackman, Elon Musk. Those are, the defectors from the tech sector, but the major winning coalition part of the Trump base are blue collar people who, according to polling, majority support tariffs and remigration. So if there is an impact from Bondi not, being inactive or not taking enough action, I don't think it's going to be in the near term.
Mm-hmm. All right. Question for Jared. If Vietnam does get involved in a war with China, would China conduct a land invasion? If so, what does that look like? So I think we've pretty much established that China is not going to blockade Taiwan without starting a war simultaneously with Japan and the Philippines. I'd imagine if China does get into a war, let's say they drop Taiwan. I don't think they will, but let's just say they do, and they say, all right, we're going to focus on Vietnam. That's going to draw a U.S. response, and probably along with Japanese and Taiwanese and Filipino response as well here. So realistically, Jared, what do you make of this?
I don't think that China would conduct a land invasion, and you're right to bring up that this would likely bring up a response, because nobody says we are defending Taiwan. They say we're defending the status quo of the Indo-Pacific. So if you attack anybody, we're all in this together.
Mm-hmm. Sure seems to be the case. All right. Well, Jared, Robert, thank you. And thank you for watching. We have no more questions. So that's going to do it for today's morning briefing. As always, we appreciate your support. We also produce a written report every morning. So if you'd like those details, and also if you want access to the Early Warning Network Intel and News platform for coverage throughout the day, you can do that. Head over to www.earlywarningnetwork.com, start a free 7-day trial, and see what we're all about. And not only that, information is a commodity. We could be bro-cent guys and just surf foreign Telegram channels all day and post stuff. But what we do here is we break down and explain things. We put events in context with a specific look toward the future. What does this mean for you? How is this going to impact you? What can we expect in the future? And that's really what we specialize in here. So if you'd like access to our report, if you want to stay ahead of the curve on all things domestic, geostrategic, the far left, economics and finance, earlywarningnetwork.com. Hit the subscribe button. With that, everyone, have a great rest of your day. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on this show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.